Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the newest album from Baroness, Golden Grey. Overall, I was pretty excited to hear a new Baroness record. They're a band that I think have been pretty consistent over the years. They have had some projects that I like more than others, but for the most part, I've enjoyed everything that they've dropped to varying extent, so I didn't really think that this new album was going to be any different. I thought some of the singles from this thing were a bit all over the place in terms of some of their sound. I thought the first single from this thing, Borderlines, was pretty good overall. I thought Seasons was an okay track, though maybe a little bit forgettable. It wasn't really until the release of the third single from this thing, Throw Me an Anchor, that I got pretty concerned for the release of this project, considering composition-wise I thought that track was pretty solid, but the production on that song was not very good, and I was afraid that the rest of this album would be like that as well, considering that Borderlines and Seasons also didn't really have great production, but I didn't think it was as big a problem on either of those two tracks, at least compared to Throw Me an Anchor. So now we have Golden Grey out. I've heard it a good amount of times at this point. I've got a fully fleshed out opinion on it, and overall, I gotta say, I was pretty let down by this album, and it's primarily due to one reason, and that is, like I kind of alluded to before, the production on this thing. The production on this album is just, simply put, terrible. And I get that they're, a rock metal band. I know lots of rock and metal bands out there don't use great production. However, I do want to point out that this isn't like some really lo-fi black metal release or something like that, where the rawness really adds to the sound of the music. I mean, I think having terrible production quality on a release like that could work to that album's benefit. This isn't the case with this album, though. The style of music Baroness are making on this thing is barely even metal for the most part, as the sound that they have going for them here is more of this heavy psychedelic rock-esque sound, a stoner rock, stoner metal type sound. You do have some softer cuts sprinkled throughout this thing as well. It's definitely the band's least heavy release to date, and I don't think that's a particularly bad thing necessarily, since I do think the band can do these softer sounds nicely, but it just means that the sound of this album doesn't match up nicely with the production style that it has. In addition to that, I really wouldn't consider myself much of a production snob by any means. There's plenty of albums out there that don't really have great production that I could still enjoy to varying extents. A nice example of that would even be some material that Baroness has released in the past, like their last album, for example, which similarly didn't really have great production. However, I didn't really get in the way of me enjoying that project for the most part. It was just kind of a minor distraction more than anything else. However, on Golden Grey here, it's gotten even worse, and it gets to the point where a lot of these songs are borderline unlistenable. And it's just such a shame, too, because when it comes to the compositions on this album, they're all pretty good overall. In fact, without the production problems on this thing, this could have been one of my favorite albums of the year. Not like towards the top of my year-end list or anything quite that good, but still a really solid album, and definitely a nice addition to Baroness's catalog. However, like I said, the production really holds the majority of the songs on this thing back from being the best that they could really be. When it comes to what exactly is wrong here with the production on this project, you do have some clipping going on. A lot of the instrumentals sound really blown out and loud, and it makes a lot of these instrumentals really muddy sounding. It's very difficult to make out a lot of the details of what's going on here, which is a shame because a lot of these instrumentals do sound really detailed and intricate at times. For example, a track like Borderlines, I could pick up on some guitar work going on. It's a lot more detailed and flavorful than what's able to be gotten across with this production style, which just makes everything sound really loud and flat, and you can't really make out a lot of what's going on. It's like this production puts a haze around every bit of the instrumentation. It's difficult to make out things in a lot of detail. A lot of the compositions on this album clearly had a lot of time and effort put into them in order to make them as detailed and interesting as possible, but unfortunately this doesn't come across due to the production here on the album. Some of the worst offenders on this project when it comes to the production is Throw Me the Anchor, as I said before, especially the start of this track where the drums come in and then the guitars. It just sounds like this big noisy mess that is probably the most painful moment on the album to listen to, and I mean that in a very literal sense. The second track on the album, I'm Already Gone, features some pretty great vocal performances, and overall it's a somewhat catchy track as well. However, the instrumental to this song is just so muddy sounding, and it just drowns out the vocals to some extent as well. It really does make the track not enjoyable to listen to for one thing, but also really frustrating too, as it's just one example on this album of a track showcasing a lot of potential, but not being able to live up to it to the fullest degree because of the production. The interlude track that pops up before Throw Me an Anchor, Anchor's Lammet, is another one of the cuts on here where I feel like the production is just really bad. This interlude track features some vocal work as well as some strings too, and it's mostly the strings that I want to focus on because they just sound abysmal here on this track. It kind of sounds like this cyborg bee is dying and is landed in my ear. That's what the buzzing noise kind of sounds like on this track between the string work and the production. It's just really, really unpleasant. Fortunately, following Throw Me an Anchor, you do have a stretch of tracks on this album that try to be a bit more subdued sounding, a bit softer overall, and as a result of this, the production isn't quite as bad on some of these tracks. It is still there, but just with the style of music that the band is playing, it's not as noticeably bad, I guess you could say, and as a result, this stretch of tracks is probably the best on the album. It starts off with the track I'd Do Anything, which is probably one of the stronger cuts on this thing. The instrumental is pretty simple overall. It can't really overpower the vocals on this track because of it, and the vocal performance on this track is pretty great too. Overall, it's a nice softer track on the album and definitely one of the album's stronger moments. The track Cold-Blooded Angels that comes later on starts off slower as well. However, as the track progresses, it does get a bit heavier sounding, and I have mixed feelings on this. When it comes to it from a compositional standpoint, I quite like this because it just makes the track a lot more interesting as a result of that. However, of course, there's the issue of the production, which makes the second part of this track a lot less enjoyable to listen to because, once again, once the track gets a bit heavier and noisier, the production becomes a much bigger problem. The final portion of this album is a section that I think is pretty mixed overall in terms of quality. You have tracks like Borderlands, which I think is one of the stronger cuts on this thing, though I've certainly cooled on it a fair bit since first hearing it as a single a few months back. I do think it's still one of the more interesting tracks on this thing compositionally, and I do think the production on this track is not quite as bad as on some of the others. At the very least, the sound that the band is going for on the song works better with this production style. Kind of reminds me of some of the tracks off their last album where the production is still not that great and it's noticeable, but it just doesn't bother me as much. I really don't know why, but yeah, this is definitely one of the stronger cuts on the album still. However, you also have cuts like the closing song to the album, Pale Sun, which is kind of an interesting cut. It's a bit of a more quiet, stripped back song. However, I just don't find it to be super interesting, even if I think the production here on this track is, far from the worst on this album overall. Aside from the production on this album, which is, like I said before, easily my biggest problem with it, the overall runtime of this thing is another thing I really do not care for. It just feels really bloated, and I feel like a lot of the little interludes that pop up on this thing are just really unnecessary and take up way too much of the album's runtime. Like, I know Baroness have done some of these tracks before on previous projects, but at most it was maybe like one or two of them. But on this thing, there's a whole bunch of them, and they're just, not interesting in the slightest. The most interesting one is the Anchor's Lammet that I mentioned before, given that it does have some vocals in it, and the string instrumentation is certainly unique. However, like I said before, the production really does ruin any enjoyment that interlude might give you. A lot of the other interludes on this album just aren't very interesting. Some do maybe try for a bit of a different sound with some electronic elements. Some do stick to a more rock-focused sound, but regardless, they're all boring. They're all really uninteresting. Some of them go on for way too long as well. Some of them are like 2 minutes long, just completely unnecessary, and they take up way too much of this album's runtime. And aside from the interludes, the track Emmet Radiating Light is probably one of the most forgettable cuts on this thing, if not one of the most forgettable cuts Baroness have ever written. It's another one of the more stripped back cuts on this thing, and while the production on this song is not all that terrible, it's another one of the cuts on this thing where, due to the overall sound of this track, the production is just not that bad. I still feel like this track is one of the worst on the album just because it's so uninteresting and forgettable, as I said before. It almost feels like a really extended interlude with how much is going on here in this song. And I just feel like, along with the interludes and stuff, this track could have been cut as well. When it comes to all the performances from the band themselves on this project, they do a really solid job, as I've mentioned previously. A lot of the vocal performances on this thing are really solid. A lot of the guitar work is great as well. Really, all the instruments, in terms of the compositions on here and what they're playing, are pretty good overall. It's just that the production kind of ruins a lot of it for me personally. I also feel like a lot of the lyrics on this thing are pretty solid as well. It's just, it really is, at the end of the day, the production that kills this project for me. And it's just such a disappointing listen, Golden Grey, because so much of this album is really good overall. Like I said, the compositions on here for the most part are really great. A lot of the performances are really good as well. And in terms of the overall style of this album, it definitely is a step in a different direction for the band. Like I said earlier, they are moving away even further from the metal sound that they started out in. They're doing a bit more with some psychedelic sounds, some stoner rock-esque sounds too, and some softer sounds as well, as I mentioned previously. It's just that this barely, registers with me when I'm listening to the album because of the production, which is just overbearing over everything else. Like, I know it seems like I've spent pretty much all of this review talking about the production and how it ruins the experience of this album, but, like, there's so little else for me to talk about, I feel, because whenever I'm listening to this album, the production is just this, at best, this nagging thought in the back of my head, and at worst, it's beating me over the head with how bad it is. It's just this inescapable fact of the album that regardless of what track you're listening to, you can't run away from it. It's always there. Ruining tracks, making them sound awful, constantly reminding you that this album could have sounded much better without it. It's just a really disappointing listen for me personally because, like I said, the compositions here are great. Baroness are putting in some great work here. It's just this one factor, really, that ruins the album. And I know I complained about the runtime, too, but if you kept the runtime but changed the production, I still think this would have been a pretty good album overall. Not a perfect one, but still really good. So overall, I can't really say that I'd recommend this album to you unless you're like a hardcore Baroness fan, but at that point, I mean, you're going to listen to the album already. You probably already have listened to the album, so it really doesn't matter if I recommend it or not, because, while a lot of what this album does is pretty solid when it comes to how the songs are written and performed, the production is not good, as I've said more than enough times already at this point in the review. So, yeah, that's all there really is to it. I'm just hoping that one day, eventually, we get to hear this album with some improved production, maybe a live version of some of these songs that sound better as well. I just hope I don't have to wait for a 25-year anniversary of this thing to hear the remastered version that is actually listenable, because I do really want to hear these songs with better production, because these are good songs overall when it comes to how they're written and stuff, as I said multiple times. It's just this one factor that just ruins everything about this project, and that's what's so frustrating about this album. More than anything, this album is frustrating. So, yeah, that's all there really is for me to say about it at this point. At this point, I'm just going to go in circles. So, yeah, that's my review. That's my thoughts on the project, just my own personal opinion. So if you happen to disagree, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own thoughts on this album in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. Things like album reviews, track reviews, things of that sort. If you enjoy that kind of content, make sure you subscribe. Thank you for watching once again, and stay golden.